Well, hey, everybody. We are excited to be joining you again on our podcast, On the Other Hand, and where we've been really talking around an issue that we've entitled Snowflakes and Homesteaders, a thing that really has been an important subject matter for us around here as we seek to lead, but I think is a valuable resource for all of us as we deal with our own issues or the issues that we face as church leaders.
Yeah, and we've been, and we sort of brought this out last week in the podcast, but specifically dealing with the topic of counseling.
Yeah.
And just realizing even over the course of this week, as we've had more conversation, that we need to bring some definition, but maybe we could start by defining homesteaders and snowflakes, because the reality is not everybody who's going to be watching this has our understanding of homesteaders in the Alaskan sense, you know, these salt of the earth, hardworking, resilient type of people. And so maybe you could give us first sort of the definition of a homesteader.
Yeah, and I kind of said I was more or less, because of my background and things, identified more in that camp, typically as my gut instinct, right? And I know a lot of people do, and I would describe homesteader as like, if you remember the John Wayne mentality, where you kind of you can take on life, you kind of know what to do. And when adversity is in your way, in some ways you sort of ignore the emotions and you do the thing that needs to be done, and you just keep pressing in. Right. And so that's the homesteader. It's a little bit of the tough guy maybe mentality, and that's what I think of.
Yeah, which sounds really mature.
Right.
Like, well, I guess those are the good guys and the snowflakes are the bad guys, right? I would put the snowflake in this category, because right now, and generally speaking in pop culture, that's a real divisive sort of term or an accusatory term. But I would say for our purposes, when we use that language, I'm talking about people who endlessly are trying to figure out what's wrong with them. It's very me-focused, self-centered in its approach, but I think the underlying desire is to know what's wrong with me. Yeah. Why do I act the way I do? Why do I react the way I do? Whose fault is it? I would say much of it falls into that category. Where is the blame to be laid? And it feels like this endless pursuit of evaluating, assessing, trying to figure out why I'm the way I am. And so we sort of split it into those two groups. And I think for us, or at least for me, I've had lots of experience with the homesteader mentality.
Many people grew up in that, especially in Christian circles, and ended up casting sort of a negative view on counseling or seeking help or those kinds of things.
Yeah. Why do you need to go talk to a counselor? That's not going to do you any good. That shrink isn't going to help you out, right? They're all quacks, and there's sort of just that general perception in that arena. So just maybe a brief story to kind of describe some of my experience. I commercial fished here in Alaska for several years, and my skipper would have been the classic homesteader in Alaska. Hardworking Norwegian, had kind of built literally everything they had up with his own hands. Hard story of coming to Alaska, living out in the middle of nowhere, building a life for themselves, and
the dream.
Yeah, and I had a lot of respect for him. I got to know his sons, who are now in their 70s themselves. And to discover the sorts of relational issues that were created as a result of life with Dad, who never talked about his problems, didn't need to talk about them. We just keep moving on, pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, and yet experienced a significant amount of relational fallout and dysfunction. And so you find yourself wondering, like, why couldn't you just see that there was something there? What would have been wrong with talking with somebody about it? How did you get to where you were so that you could have healthier relationship?
And there's the other side of the story too, right? Where I've personally we've encountered through the years or in ministry, everybody out there, I'm sure has encountered somebody who is kind of perpetually in counseling or just always needing somebody to be speaking into their life to feel healthy. And But it never felt like it was good enough, or they're always moving from one to the next, to the next, to the next thing. And if you espouse the homestead mentality, there's something there that you just kind of like rebel against that. Is that is that good? And our culture, and this is what, we want to talk about edgy, controversial topics on the other hand. And so those are the two polarizing sort of views that you discover presently in our culture. Whether you're Christian or outside, it doesn't really matter. Those are cultural polarization views. Yeah. But we talked about we brought up some terms as we were talking about this last week. And we actually discussed these further, like after the podcast at length, just to make sure we were even using the same terms. So we figured you might need to be in on that, right? And which is important. Words mean things, and so we use terms like counselor. We use terms like dysfunction. What do we mean? What do we mean with some of those terms?
Yeah, because I think what we discovered even over this past week is that we actually weren't meaning the same things in using those terms. I'm coming from much more of a layman's type perspective of that versus academia, right, where these words have really specific meanings. And so when I use the word counselor, I'm not using it so loosely as I just need a friend to talk to. I am using it in the skilled sense, right, that they have some skill in an area, but I'm not using it in the clinical sense. I do not believe that every counselor that you go to has to be a licensed professional counselor or a clinical counselor. I don't believe that's unhealthy necessarily either, but that isn't what I mean when I use that term, because I believe that gifting can exist within the body without having a degree in counseling. Yeah. And I believe it can be beneficial and increase a person's skill level to have a degree in counseling. But I do mean someone outside of your normal sphere of influence or your normal circle who is uniquely gifted or skilled in listening and helping you identify core issues.
Skillful training, and it's important to hone in on that outside of your immediate sphere because perspective is what's so valuable, right? And objectivity, and that ability to ask important questions to draw things out that can actually put us on the path towards health. And oftentimes we lack those tools personally, or we don't have people around us who are able to ask those questions. And actually there's an example in the Bible I thought of between last set and this, and that is, Job. And he's in the scriptures, right? And he's going through hell on earth, right? I mean, he is going through it. And in that moment, some counselors come his way, some friends of his, and we often go there first. And they give all kinds of great advice. And if you read some of that, some of it makes good sense, but it wasn't actually what led to life or a better experience or even a godly perspective, and it had damage associated with it. So maybe some of us have even been there, and so the outside perspective is important. So those are some of the terms. We also brought up the idea of dysfunction. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, and I think as we've talked through this and I've thought about it more, I'm making a distinction between identity and issues, right? So in life, we all have issues that come up, things that present themselves, dysfunctions in our relationships. And I think often from a homesteader perspective, that begins to be viewed as an identity. I'm not saying you're dysfunctional as a person. I'm saying there are dysfunctions. The goal would be to address them, right? That they could be whole, that they could be well. But to use the term dysfunctional, there is a clinical sort of approach to that. But then there's also this, in my mind at least, a general approach to it. And so the term, I think, often makes sense more so than maybe like the biblical term you had brought up in our conversations of weakness. Right. Weakness could be any number of things, but when I understand that it's actually creating some brokenness relationally with others,
doing damage,
then all of a sudden I'm like, okay, this isn't just a weakness. There's an outcome to it, and that outcome is producing something I don't want. So how do I deal with it?
And that's important. That like relational success is what we're after. That we could use terms like biblical terms like a reconciliation or peace,
restoration.
And it's not just with other people, but it really even begins with myself, or with myself and God from a Christian vantage point, right? But it overflows into my other relationships in my home and beyond. And nobody out there, right, would say, I don't want that.
Right.
Which kind of leads us into another aspect of this discussion, and that is, if I'm sitting there and I'm listening to this in my car and I realize I have damage in relationships. In other words, I may not be able to pinpoint or identify an issue or a specific thing in my life that I think is unhealthy, but it is easier to say, well, I responded to an event and my emotional level should have been a 2, it was a 10.
Right.
What's going on? It's not necessarily an indicator of something being out of whack. Sometimes it's just we're exhausted and, and we're just at the end of
We're talking about consistency.
We're talking about this consistent behavior. We don't know why. But we can pinpoint and say damage was done as a result.
Yep.
And so if somebody is sitting there listening to this and they're saying, okay, I admit I can see that this has been unhealthy. What do you think it is? Because I think this is true of a lot of us. What do you think it is that keeps us from seeking health?
Right. No, it's a great question. I maybe you've heard of the Bob principle before, right? Bob gets fired from this job and then this job and then this job. Yeah. And so, but Bob is always coming back and saying, and he's describing to the next job, right? Listen, the last place I was at, they were just jerks and they didn't understand me and they didn't have any grace for me. You experience this in churches as well, right? We often use the term church hoppers. But they show up at the next place telling the story from the previous place, and then it's a matter of time before they leave there and go to the next. At some point, you have to stop and ask, because this is the Bob principle, what is the consistent in each of the situations?
That's right.
Bob's there in all of them.
Problems follow you wherever you go.
Yeah, wherever you go, there you are.
That's right.
And so it's worth at least asking the question. And so people may be experiencing that right now.
Yeah.
And to get really precise to your question, what is it that keeps us, when we recognize those things in our own lives, what is it that keeps us from asking for help, from pursuing health? Because I think we sort of at the core want to pursue health. But the question is, what keeps us from doing that? And so I actually think the answer is the same for both the homesteader and the snowflake. I think for the homesteader, there's this sense of that would do damage to my ego or my reputation. I should be able to figure this out on my own. I've been able to figure everything else out in my life on my own. We've been able to survive and build up the homestead. And I think there's this sense that if I acknowledge that I need you to look into my life and give me input, and give me clarity, help me figure out why I respond in these ways, then I'm clearly not a grown-up. I'm not mature. I'm not strong enough. I'm not stable enough. And I think it's ego that drives that. But I think the same thing is true on the other side. Yeah,
tell a little bit more about that other side too, because the question is like, what keeps me from, what is it that keeps me from actually getting healthy? Because we can just be perpetually lost in this world of seeking help.
Right. Yeah. On the one side, you never ask for help. You just, I got it figured out, and you experience these relational dysfunctions and brokenness. On the other side, you could spend your whole life figuring out who to blame, whose fault is it that I'm like I am, and you actually end up doing the exact same thing. You actually never take ownership, right? At some point, you have to acknowledge that I've sorted through the past wounds, hurts, losses, and now I need to just own my future, how I'm going to respond to those things. And I think that can be really terrifying, can feel the same way, like I'm admitting that I don't have what it takes to be healthy.
Yeah, and I would admit, right, this is an issue when in our youth. You know, maybe we had that story where our parent came to us, and you go back and you remember they caught us lying, and they're like, you know, did you steal that thing, or did you lie? And in that moment, we had all this shame and all this guilt, this desire to defend ourselves or why it happened, and so there's this natural tendency in humanity, I would say, and the Bible would teach us that to hide. And so I can imagine especially if you grew up more with a homesteader mentality, saying, yeah, my junk is my junk. Your junk is your junk. We'll just, I'm going to deal with this. I'm going to hide this thing. And inevitably that can produce damage in relational.
Well, I think it's hardwired into humanity to not simply sort of hide, which you see in the Garden of Eden, right? The first thing they do is they go and hide. But it's also hardwired within humanity to blame.
That's right. That's right.
So Adam's response is, "It was that woman you gave me." Right? He blames the woman and he blames God, both in that situation.
Which is relevant.
Yeah.
For today.
Yep.
Because it feels like we've moved culturally, by and large anyway, general terminology here, from a John Wayne culture more to the snowflake blame culture. Mm-hmm. Yep. And you can even see that in generations. And what do we do with that?
Well, and the reality is, when you step back, you recognize it's even happening with the homesteader, right? The homesteader saying it's all of those liberals, it's those snowflakes. Yeah. They're the ones who got us where we are. They're not taking ownership, right? And on the other side, nobody's taking ownership there either. And so I think actually both the blame and the hiding from our own issues exist in both groups.
All right, that's good. We've discovered we're there. We've discovered I've done damage. We're sitting there listening to this and going, okay, so I want out. Last set, we talked a little bit just about a paradigm from Greg Dempster and that we've used here on our staff to kind of walk people through that. Just briefly, if you didn't look backwards to last week's episode, walk us through that real quick. It's good stuff.
Yeah, and I think we said this last week, but to be really clear, we're talking about a tool. Right? If it's helpful, it's helpful. If it's not, it's not. Because sometimes I don't need to look back and figure out where anything came from. I need to identify it and look forward. Sometimes, like in my case, it's been really helpful to identify where did this start. And so in that model, it's these four sort of areas that you're looking at. One is a wounded episode, right? Something that's happened. It doesn't have to even be extreme. In my case, it wasn't. It was a perspective that was built over time about how authority in my life will or will not engage with me. And I realized I began to view God very much in that same way, aloof, disconnected, those kinds of things. And so there's this wounded episode somewhere, right, if it were the base layer, and from there come these distorted perspectives. Well, how did that shape the way I view the world, the way I view people around me, the way I view God? And then from there, you've got these dysfunctional emotions. And when we use that language, we're just saying, listen, emotion is not bad, right? Emotion is actually biblical. It's godly. What we're talking about is an overreaction.
We have the full range of emotions. Whatever
Absolutely.
God experiences, we're in the image of God. We would say we can experience those emotions.
Yeah, it's not inherently evil to be angry any more than it's inherently evil to be joyful. Like we never said about joy.
Right.
But so it's not that I have emotion or even strong emotion about something. This is disproportionate to what the situation actually should have commanded for the average person and what I even want. So dysfunctional emotions and these dysfunctional emotions lead to unhealthy lifestyle choices. What I like about this is I could identify myself in any one of those areas and work towards health, right? Because wholeness is the goal. And so once I understand this wounded episode, this distorted perspective, how is it that I see myself, the people around me, and God in relationship to it? How's it shaped the way I think, my worldview? And how's it affected my emotional responses, and what unhealthy lifestyle choices are a result of that? And often I can find wholeness through that process.
Yeah, and so the value there for all of us is wholeness. What do we mean by wholeness? And one of the things that we've discussed outside of this moment, right, is kind of the Hebrew idea that if you're in Christian circles, you're more familiar with, but it's this idea of shalom, this ability to bring health is another way to say that, or wholeness to myself, to my relationship specifically with my Creator.
At peace.
At peace. There's this sense that from God's perspective, we are in a together relationship because there's nothing in between, which is the foundation, the Bible would teach, right, to all of our other relationships. And it goes back to the identity issue there is, how in terms of identity, how would I describe or define myself? Am I a person who is a child of God who can experience these things, who has access to this relationship? And one of the things that you and I discussed that I think is important for our listeners, right, is as we're talking about counseling or going outside of myself or even my immediate community or church community to seek help, or whether that's a licensed counselor or just wise counsel, is knowing that that the Bible gives some promises to us here, right? Yep. And that for instance, Romans talks about the renewing of the mind. Yeah. That this is a process, that God didn't just save us to heaven, that this process is valuable to discuss and investigate because He wants us to live whole here. Right.
Yeah, and that's why I think for me in this process that I've been in, maybe for the first time in my life, I've actually experienced experientially, wholeness. Not the endless pursuit of identifying the problem, right, which is easy to get stuck in and actually comforting in some ways. Okay, it's not my fault, right? We talked about last week, my friend Aaron saying our generation is the first one to figure out that we can blame our parents for our problems. The next generation will discover they can blame their children, right? It's the millennials' fault. That's why we are where we are, right? That is an endless cycle. That is not the goal, is to figure out who to blame. The goal is the biblical promise of health and wholeness, that we could live at peace with God.
And it's possible.
It's possible. It's possible. And so I think leaving the listener with that anticipation, that there is it's worth stepping in. It's worth saying I need help and doing the work. It's also worth saying I don't need this forever. My desire would be to live at peace with God. And I can have some simple tools to help me live in that place.
All right. Well, here we go. Hope that was a great experience for you. Hope that was valuable.
Way too little time.
And meaningful, absolutely. And we're actually going to step one more episode into this, kind of a unique way. Looking forward to that. But we would love it if you would follow, subscribe, or share to this podcast. That'd help us out a ton. We hope that this reaches a broad audience and is helpful for you. We'll see you next week.